Good morning, good morning, good morning. Wanted to make a brief statement before we start about things that are probably more important than the numbers, and folks like me sometimes get caught up in the numbers. I want to talk very briefly about what happened in Manchester, England. I think the President this morning summed it up emotionally for a lot of us. He just called these people who perpetrated this, one person, there may be more, evil losers. The President has I think Barron's 11 or 12. I took my son to his first concert when he was 11 or 12, and I think all of us who have children that age and take them to concerts, this is something that hits especially close to home, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with our ally and our friends in the UK, and also have the victims and their families in our hearts as we talk about these other things that somehow pale in comparison. With that said, let's talk about the budget. And I know that some of you were here yesterday, and I'll some of what I say at the opening be a repeat, but a lot of folks were not here. So let's talk about what this is. This is the President's FY 2018 budget. The name on the cover is the New Foundation for American Greatness. Okay. As I read through it over the weekend, as I did, in fact, we've been working on this since before I actually got here, it struck me that the title should have been different, that the title should have been a taxpayer first budget, because that's what this is. And as I was trying to reconcile those two things, well, it's called the New Foundation for American Greatness, but I wanted to call it the taxpayer first budget. It struck me that that was what was really new, or one of the things that was new about this budget. That we looked at this budget through the eyes of the people who were actually paying the bills. I think for years and years, we've simply looked at a budget in terms of the folks who are on the back end of the programs, the recipients of the taxpayer money, and we haven't spent nearly enough time focusing our attention on the people who pay the taxes. I got a couple questions yesterday. I know I will today about compassion. Compassion needs to be on both sides of that equation. Yes, you have to have compassion for folks who are receiving the federal funds, but also you have to have compassion for the folks who are paying it. And that is one of the things that is new about this President's budget. What else is new? It's new in that it balances for the first time in at least 10 years. The last time we looked, we couldn't find a President Obama budget that balanced ever. I think he tried a couple times to convince us that primary balance, which was balance without regard for interest payments on the debt, was balanced. We reject that. We get to an actual balance on this budget within the 10-year window. It begins to reduce the size of the debt relative to the size of the economy in year one. Okay? That's how important it was and is to this President to try and bring some fiscal discipline. Again, if you're looking through the perspective of the people who pay, you'd like to be able to tell them at some point in the foreseeable future you're going to be able to balance. The previous administration completely gave up on that. As I've said before to the previous administration, if you borrow money, if I take money from you and I have no intention of ever giving it back, that is not debt, that is theft. And if we're going to borrow money from people, we have to have a plan for how we are going to pay it back. And that's what this budget does, and that's one of the things that is new about this budget. The next word in the title is foundation. What is the foundation that we're trying to build here? And I sum it up this way. Again, I saw an article a couple weeks ago about what is Trumponomics. And the Trumponomics is part of the foundation here. What is it? It's sustained 3% economic growth. Everything that we do in this administration, every single time I am called into the Oval Office, whether it's on immigration policy, healthcare policy, tax reform policy, trade policy, budgets and spending, the focus is sustained 3% economic growth. We have been attacked stunningly by some folks on the left and even in the mainstream who say that that's an unreasonable assumption. We should stop and think how absurd that is, to think that 3% growth in an American economy is to some people an absurd assumption. It used to be normal. 10 years ago it was normal. In fact, it's been normal for the history of the country. I think the average over the 240-odd years that we've been a country has been over 3%. It's certainly been over 3% since World War II. The 1.9% growth rates that the previous administration assumed towards the end of their administration, and the 1.9% growth rates for the entire 10-year window that the CBO growth rates that the CBO assumes, the Congressional Budget Office assumes, are something we simply reject. That is a pessimistic look at what the potential for this country and for what this country's people is. We reject that pessimism and say, you know what, we probably should have gone in and assumed 3.5% or 4% growth, because that would be aggressive. 3% growth is just getting back to normal. I've said it before, I say it again. If you are 30 years old and you are watching this or you're sitting here, you have never had a job as an adult in a healthy American economy. It's either been a recession or a slow, sluggish economy stumbling along at less than 2% growth. The differences between 2% growth and 3% growth doesn't sound like much. In fact, I cringe when I hear people say it's only a 1% difference. It's not. It's a 50% difference, but that's just math. The difference in that is tangible. At 3% economic growth in a healthy American economy, if you don't like your job, you can quit because you know you can go get another job. If you get laid off, you know you can go off and start your own business. These are the opportunities that people have forgotten about. And these are the things, the optimism in the country, the dynamism in the country that the president is so eager to push back and to bring back to the country. It's what drives every one of our policies, especially when it comes to anything dealing with jobs and the economy. We will bring back 3% economic growth to this country, and those numbers are assumed in this budget. By the way, if you don't, the budget will never balance. If you assume 1.9% growth, my guess is you'll never see a balanced budget again. So we refuse to accept that that's the new normal in this country. 3% is the old normal. 3% will be the new normal again under the Trump administration, and that is part and parcel, one of the foundations of this budget. Along those same lines, the budget also speaks to and funds a lot of the president's priorities. We've talked about this since March when we unveiled, the budget blueprint. National security, obviously, a priority for this president. Border security, another priority for him. We can talk at length if you want to today about the details of the additional money that we spend in those areas. The total plus up again for the 2018 budget is $54 billion over the Congressional Budget Office baseline. The law enforcement gets a significant increase here, and that's both at the federal and the state and local level as we follow through on our efforts to enforce the law. Veterans see more money here. That's a classic example of looking at the budget through the eyes of the taxpayer. I put myself in the role of the person who's actually taking the money from you as taxpayer and giving the money to someone else in terms of a benefit. And if I can look you in the eye and say, look, I need to take this money from you so that I can help this injured vet, I can do that in good conscience. I can look you in the eye, and my guess is you're okay with that. I am a lot less comfortable to the point of not wanting to look you in the eye and say, look, I need to take this money from you to give to this person over here who really isn't disabled but is getting a disabled benefit, or this person over here who is supposed to use the money to go to school but isn't actually going, or a program that is supposed to encourage you to graduate from high school or from college but is only 6% effective. That's the type of compassion we talk about, and that's the type of different perspective that we bring to the budget. And it's one of the things that I like to talk about when we talk about the veterans. People don't mind paying their taxes as long as they know that that money is not being wasted and frittered away. We also increased spending for school choice and paid parental leave, making this president the first president of either party to propose a nationwide paid parental leave program for parents and adopted parents. There's $20 billion in that over the course of the 10-year window. I think I gave an incorrect number yesterday at 25. What are those, by the way? National security, border security, law enforcement, veteran school choice, paid parental leave. They are all campaign promises that the president made while he was running for office. And that's why I say these numbers are simply the president's policies put onto paper. We took the president's speeches, we took his priorities, we turned them into numbers, and that's what's in the document. Does not, along the same lines, not a single thing in here touches Social Security retirement or Medicare. Why? Because that's what the president said when he was campaigning, that he would not change those things. In fact, I've told the story several times of sitting in the president's office with a list of possible reforms to mandatory, what some people call entitlement spending, and have the president at the end of the list go, yes, yes, no, 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 no. And the no, no, no's were always Social Security, retirement, and Medicare. Didn't change those at all because he promised people that he wouldn't. We can do all that and balance at the same time because we look at spending differently. We're no longer going to measure compassion by the number of programs or the number of people on those programs, but by the number of people we help get off of those programs. We're not going to measure compassion by the amount of money that we spend, but by the number of people that we help. And that is how you can get 3% economic growth. That is how you can balance the budget in 10 years. That is how you can borrow money from people with still promising and intending to pay it back from them. That is how you can help people take charge of their own lives again. And that is the part of the budget that deals with the American greatness. So with that, I'll take questions for a little bit. I know there's a couple. Yes, ma'am.
So President Trump sticking to his campaign promise not to touch Medicare or Social Security retirement benefits, but not Medicaid. So how does he intend to square that with his supporters?
Yeah, a couple things about Medicaid. And this is one of my favorite stories to tell about Washington spending. Keeping in mind, and I know that y'all probably get this, but if you're watching this at home, in Washington, D.C., if you spent $100 last year on something, okay, and we spent $100 on it this year on that same thing, in Washington, people call that a cut. Okay, 100 last year, 100 this year. Y'all call it a cut. In fact, I've seen several occasions where we spent $100 last year and $102 this year, and many people will still call that a cut, because the budget is hardwired by the Congressional Budget Office to go up every single year. And if the Congressional Budget Office says we spent $100 last year and we're supposed to spend $106 this year, for a lot of people, anything less than 107 is a cut. In fact, I've actually heard 106 referred to as a freeze because it simply stays in line with the Congressional Budget Office. A classic example of how Washington speaks differently than the world back home. So a couple things about Medicaid. Okay? There are no Medicaid cuts in the terms of what ordinary human beings would refer to as a cut. We are not spending less money one year than we spent before. What we are doing is growing Medicaid more slowly over the 10-year budget window than the Congressional Budget Office says that we should or says that we will under current law. Why do we change it? We change it, and we change those growth rates in Medicaid spending because of the American Health Care Act, which this president does support. But we said from the very beginning we support the House efforts. We're looking forward and are working right now with the Senate on working on what their health care bill would look like. But we support the American Health Care Act, and that does change Medicaid. How does it change it? And this is something that I don't think enough people are talking about. It makes it a lot better and a lot more able to deliver the necessary services to the people who need it. Here's how. Medicaid is funded in large part by the states. In fact, I was in the state legislature, and our second largest line item, I think, after K-12 education was Medicaid. And we would see this program come down from Washington with all these instructions on how to use it and say, goodness gracious, this won't work in South Carolina. We happen to think, for example, that Medicaid is designed for more of an urban poor population than a rural poor, as predominates in South Carolina. And we would ask them every single year, would ask them, the federal government, give us more control over how this money gets spent. We think we can do it better. We think we can either provide the same services to the same number of people cheaper, or we can provide better service to more people at the same amount of money if you let us do it better. And the federal government always said no. In the American Health Care Act, we say yes. And we give the governors and the state legislatures a lot more control over Medicaid. Everyone is interested in seeing the truly needy in their state and in our nation get the care that we promise them in Medicaid. But there's a better way to do it than under current law, which is Obamacare. We can also talk about what a failure that is. But there's a better way to do it, and that's what the American Health Care Act does. In the back, yes, sir.
You mentioned the previous administration, the stagnant growth, and that the deficit has actually doubled since 2008, from about $10 trillion to $20 trillion. But a member of that administration, Larry Summers, today actually went on the attack. I'm curious how you would respond to his assessment of the budget. He called it simply ludicrous, and that the administration is double counting the tax cut and the benefit from growth.
But I did get a chance to just see the piece that Mr. Summers wrote on the way out the door, and I couldn't. Just the ideas were rushing into my head what I might say to Larry if he were here. So if he's hiding in the back, now would be a good time for him to come out and identify himself. I went back and looked at some of the economic assumptions that the Obama administration made in its first couple of years. And I want to say, on a couple of different occasions, their assumed growth rate was more than 4.5%. Keep in mind, this is the first administration in history, okay? It was the first decade, the first 8-year period in history not to have a 3% growth rate, yet they were promising us 4.5% growth. So if Larry wants to talk about unreasonable assumptions, we talk about my 3% growth rate and his 4.5%, and we'll talk about who actually is closer to reality. Regarding the double counting, here's one of the things I think that a lot of folks have overlooked. And we did it on purpose because it's sort of hard to count this and you don't want to make too many assumptions. You have to make assumptions about a budget. You're talking about a document that will look 10 years into the future. So it's natural for both administrations from either party to make some assumptions. But one of the assumptions we didn't make was that we didn't close any of the tax gap. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, the tax gap is the amount of money that we should collect in taxes every single year, but don't. 2016, that number is $486 billion. Almost enough to close the deficit that year. And we don't assume an additional penny of that being closed as part of our tax reform. Why is that important? There's probably three reasons people don't want to pay tax. Number one, they just don't pay tax, and there's always a certain number of people who don't want to do that. Number two, it's just too hard for them to do it. It's too complicated for them to do it. Two reasons. Now I feel like I'm a Monty Python skit. The two reasons. And we think that, exactly, that if it's a simpler tax code, okay, that people are more likely to pay. That simply makes sense. If you can really fill out your tax returns on a single piece of paper, you're much more likely to actually do it. It's also easier for us to see if you're paying the right amount. A simpler code is easier for you to pay and easier for the government to see if you're paying the right amount, which would allow us very reasonably to assume a reduction in the tax gap. And we don't do a single penny of that. So I'm aware of the criticisms, and I would simply come back and say, look, there's other places where we were probably overly conservative in our accounting. We stand by the numbers. We thought that the assumption that the tax reform would be deficit neutral was the most reasonable of the three options that we had. We could either assume that our tax reform was deficit neutral, we could assume it would reduce the deficit, we would assume it would add to the deficit. And given the fact that we're this early in the process about dealing with tax reform, we thought that assuming that middle road was the best way to do it.